Keith Payne.
Hey folks, welcome to Keith Paints. For the first time on this, my old pixel art channel. My other channel has become more focused on miniature discovery, so I'll be putting my periodic creative pursuits here from now on. So if you're not familiar with the mecha in the thumbnail, what you are watching is me preparing a Gunpla to paint. Gunpla being Gundam plastic, and Gundams being giant fighting robots from the anime Mobile Suit Gundam and its many spin-offs. This one is a Zeonic MS-06S2, a special red version for Char Aznable, one of the main antagonists in the original series from 1979, though this model kit was made for the prequel series Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin from 2015. These are model kits, but they are also toys. They come in colored plastic and don't require glue, so you can just clip them out and put them together and play with your new toy. I'm going to paint mine though, so I'm attaching all the little bits to coffee stir sticks and masking them with glue tack. I used a can of matte black Rust-Oleum spray primer that said it sticks to plastic. Now, you may be asking why I would bother painting something that comes on colored plastic, and the answer is pretty much just because I want to. Gunpla is a pretty close tangent of miniature painting, plastic toys that come on sprues and need to be clipped out and assembled. The main difference, I think, is that Gunpla are articulated toys that are meant to be played with like action figures, where painted minis, if meant to be played with at all, are meant to be used more like a chess set. For a novice mini painter like myself, Gunpla represent a challenge. I've mostly assembled easy-to-build Warhammer minis, but I have a couple sets that look quite complex, with lots of tiny parts. I was kind of nervous about building them in the past, but this project has alleviated me of those reservations. Gunpla are very complex. The first of many ways I pushed myself beyond my comfort zone on this project. As this is my first Gunpla, I really wasn't sure what I was getting into, so I took my time, exploring the model. I definitely made one mistake along the way. I glued the hands together. There are 4 hands, and too many weapons to fit that, so I presume the weapons came out of the hands. If they do, I guess they expect you to disassemble the hand each time you do it. Or discard the weapons you like least and glue the other ones in place. I just cut out the bottom of the rifle's handles so I can slip them in and out as I please. Sometimes they don't sit perfectly, but most of the time it's fine. So why did I decide to paint a Gunpla now? A couple of reasons. For one, I wanted to practice some techniques I've been working on before employing them elsewhere. Then there's Goobertown Roulette. If you watch my other channel, you may have seen my earlier Goobertown Roulette videos. Brent, from Goobertown Hobbies, has a thing for randomized miniature selection and painting schemes. Among his Patreon patrons, there is a quarterly challenge to play along and paint your own random minis. This round, the rules were simple. Choose your mini in whatever fashion you will, and roll 1d6 to determine the technique to use. Now, I have a tendency to bend the rules in the selection process, so the final product is something I can develop a decent vision for. But in this one, I didn't really have to. I just assigned projects I'd like to work on to each of the 6 options. For 1 and 2, smooth color shifts and bright fantastic clashing colors, I assigned these Bullywugs by Warplock Miniatures, with the intent of painting them as poison dart frogs. For number 3, Blacklined, I thought a Gunpla would be suitable, if not perfect. Number 4, Realism, I was going to paint this Barbarian. Though his sculpt is rather cartoony, I was going to attempt a realistic object source lighting with campfire on the low side and blue moonlight on the top side. And 5 or 6, Texture and Color Outside the Lines / Freehand, I was going to paint this Viking Warrior Lady. The Barbarian and the Viking Warrior Lady are both from Squidmar's Fiverr commissions. These and a couple others were released for free, and the rest were part of his paintbrush Kickstarter, I believe. As you have probably deduced, I rolled a 3. After priming the parts, I sprayed most of them with Mephiston Red. I use Citadel colors because there's a Games Workshop really close by, and I have pots of paint that match them exactly, which is important because I kinda suck at spray painting. I managed to cake it on in a couple spots, obscuring a bit of detail, but it wasn't too bad. I also didn't get perfect coverage everywhere, so I had to go over it with more Mephiston Red and a brush. Even so, it's still way quicker and easier spraying them first. It usually takes me a good 4 or 5 coats of Mephiston Red to get good coverage with a brush. The torso is a slightly darker shade of red. For this I'm using Corn Red, the more evil red. These colors don't match the originals perfectly, but they're the colors I have and look good enough to me, so that's what I'm going with. After getting my reds nice and solid, I felt it was time to assemble it. There were some little spots that I needed to paint black, but the actual moving parts, like knees and elbows, were left as bare plastic. I did manage to chip the paint in a couple spots, but I'm planning on doing battle damage later, so they'll fit in just fine. But that's the third technique I want to try. First, it's time to practice my wet blending. It's pretty normal to accentuate shadows on miniatures to make them more noticeable, but Gunpla move. The light could be coming from any direction depending on how you pose it, but I still wanted to make it pop a little more. So on all the recessed or downward facing parts for a normal standing pose, I applied a darker red, just the base color mixed with a bit of black. How I applied it is the fun part. Wet blending involves applying multiple colors to the model before the paint dries, allowing you to make nice blends between the two. The technique that I have started to really like is called the loaded brush technique. This involved loading your brush with one color, then dipping it in another, and applying both colors of your blend at the same time. What I found worked best is loading your brush with the base color you already have applied, then dipping it in the second color and painting on a gradient in one stroke. In my case, I loaded it with red, then dipped it in the darker red. The consistency is still something I'm working on. The first color needs to be pretty dilute to fill your brush, but the second color does not. I still want to play with it more, but if the second color is too thick, it's more likely to leave brush marks or thick layers of paint. The black parts, I did my best to give subtle gradients between Abaddon Black and darkened Mechanica Standard Gray. Next, it's time for technique number 2, hand painting. This set came with some stickers that I promptly discarded. The straight white lines I can paint easy enough, I think, and I've got plans for the rest. I start by using one of the coffee stir sticks to try and guide me in painting straight lines, but I found it wasn't even necessary. You'll also notice that I don't start with pure white. I mix it with the red that I'm covering first. This is for 2 reasons. One, if I mess up, pink is easier to touch up with red than white is. And second, white is a dumb color. It's hard to find a white that applies nicely due to large molecule size of the pigment, I believe. It has a tendency to look terrible if you don't work up to it. White lines complete, I go back with a bit of red and put some tiny scratches on them. It helps to sell the realism of painted on stripes. After the scratches on the white lines, I proceeded to do scratches on all the red. I tried using a piece of torn foam to do it, but found using a sharp brush easier. I broke out my Artis Opus tiny brush for the first time, and it didn't let me down. I'm not sure I should have done the chipping yet though. I think maybe I should have done technique 4 before technique 3. But after chipping the white paint, I just sort of moved on to chip all the paint. I had never really tried this before. The technique I went with was to take a highlight color and paint little dots and lines, and then in some of the larger ones, paint a little gray to look like the scratch went through to the metal, or ceramite, or whatever. On the Mephiston Red, I used Wild Rider Red, and over the Corn Red, I used Evil Sun's Scarlet. And for both, I used Mechanica Standard Gray for the deep chips. I forgot to put chips on the knees and elbows, but the weapons, I used Mechanica Standard Gray with Leadbelcher Silver for the deep chips. The fourth technique I wanted to try was to use an oil wash to do the black lining. To do this, you are supposed to spray your model with gloss varnish, Mix oil paint with odorless mineral spirits, then apply with a sharp brush to panel lines. Due to the smoothness of the gloss finish, capillary action pulls the oil wash along all the recesses. You can then come back with some mineral spirits on a cloth or Q-tip and wipe away any excess. I only had matte or satin varnish though. The satin worked, but not like magic like I've seen in other people's videos. Also, I'm not sure the oil paint I used was good enough. It was from an old art box set I was given where I used everything but the oil paints because I just don't really use oil paints. The paint was fine, but not black enough. Maybe I just needed more paint or something, but I had a limited amount of space to experiment with before I was all done. It still worked though, so I'm happy with it. Goobertown Roulette conditions complete. The reason I think I should have panel lined before chipping is that it requires varnish both before and after, both of which will dull down the chips and highlights a little. Finally, to replace those stickers I threw away, I modeled and 3D printed some heraldry for him. SLA printers are pretty good, but not quite good enough yet. I did manage to get all this to print, but using it was another story. Next time I print text of this size, I will definitely consider putting it on a backplate. The tiniest text was so small that the supports stuck them together, but the medium text fell apart and was unusable. The larger text was fiddly and went on in pieces, but worked well enough. It didn't look right without the stencil cutouts, which made it a little bit harder. I painted them all silver and shaded them with Nuln Oil before putting them on, which I did with a bit of matte medium. The eagle in the triangle is Char Aznabel's personal symbol, I believe, with the wreath added after he takes command. There were sticker options that didn't include the wreath. The other symbol represents the Principality of Zeon and says, "The Space Strike Fleet" on the left and Zeonic MS-06 Zaku 2 on the other. The word fleet is crooked, and I don't think it actually says 2 after Zaku like it's supposed to, but I wasn't playing with it anymore. I have definitely pushed my 3D printer to its limit, as well as myself in several ways, and it definitely paid off. I already have an MS-04 Bugu ready for sometime later this year. This was a pretty long project, and whenever I'm just sitting around painting, I like to listen to audiobooks or podcasts. Brent has a podcast called Paint Bravely, and I had heard him say this before they started the podcast. This project was very much about hobbying bravely, and pushing myself past my comfort zone, and I'd like to thank Brent for inspiring our community. This project, however, I was listening to audiobooks. Specifically, I made it through 2 books from the Warhammer 40,000 Horus Heresy series, numbers 49 and 50. Some people will suggest that it may not be worth reading 50 books in a series that already has over 60 titles and is still not finished, and I can't really fault their reasoning. Some of those early books are pretty repetitive, and yeah, these books are pretty pulpy sometimes, not exactly high literature. But, as someone who paints a lot, I have a lot of time to listen to audiobooks, and even if the book sucks, my time has still been spent productively. Book 49 is called Wolfsbane. It's about a battle, and the journey to that battle between 2 brothers, Leman Russ and Horus Lupercal, the leaders of great armies, the Space Wolves and the former Luna Wolves, now known as the Sons of Horus. There's a side plot, though, about none other than a very young and baseline human Belisarius Cawl. His first dialogue in the book is him decrying the mechanization of fellow Mechanicum members, concerned about them losing their humanity. Pure gold. Book 50 is called Born of Flame, The Hammer and the Anvil. It's a book of short stories, mostly about brother to Leman and Horus, Vulcan, and his creations, great weapons. It takes place both before, during, and after the heresy, and is about his sons trying to preserve the 7 he allowed them to keep, when he demanded the rest be destroyed before going off to Istavan. Anyway, this video isn't sponsored by Audible or anything. I just wanted to encourage anyone out there who may be getting bogged down in the early books. They do diverge from the repetitive nature of the early ones. I find they become much more interesting in the mid-20s. You never know, maybe someone will start a channel doing thorough book-by-book summaries of the whole series so you can get the spoilers without getting bored. Anyway, that's gonna be all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.